Welcome back to the Brewer Fanatic podcast, off-season edition. We're your co-hosts Jack Stern and Spencer Michaelis, coming to you for the first time in a couple weeks now. Not a whole lot of action for us to talk about over the holidays since we last spoke to everybody who's listening, but we did get a few questions to go through, and Spencer came up with a very fun game that we could play on this episode, presenting what we would do if we were running the Brewers, our off-season plans. We'll get to those in a few minutes, but before we jump into the show, Spencer, I haven't talked to you for a while, at least in a non-texting fashion, I guess would be the way to say it. How was your Thanksgiving? How was your holiday?
Yeah, it was good. It was good. Got to see a lot of family that don't see very often, which is always fun. Couple family members in from Georgia that I hadn't seen for a few years. So really good to see everybody and just have some relaxation time. Definitely not going to complain about any of that. But yeah, overall, really good. How about you?
It was a good week for me, too. I kind of worked ahead on some stuff. So the stories that I had that came out that week of Thanksgiving, I had worked on those well ahead of time to kind of put them in the bank for that week so that I could take that whole week off. I was on standby in case the Brewers made a move, but other than that, that was the only thing I would have done any work for. So I was not disappointed that the Brewers stayed quiet over that week of Thanksgiving because it allowed me to kind of not get fully off the grid, but kind of take a step back a little bit and relax. And that's something you need every once in a while. But now we're jumping back on the horse, and the offseason is also kind of jumping back on the horse a little bit. We have the winter meetings coming up very soon here next week, actually. So the GMs will be in Dallas starting on Monday, and then that goes through Thursday of next week, December 12th. And we'll kind of touch a little bit briefly after we get through some of this other stuff on what we could see going down during that time. But it is a period of time where you start to see a little bit more action across the big leagues because you have everybody in the same hotel getting things done, or at the very least having discussions about things and laying the groundwork for some stuff that could happen a few weeks after that. But first, we'll take a few listener questions just to kind of kick things off here. We'll start with Mason, who sent us a question via email. He asked us for our thoughts on Yoan Moncada as somebody who could fill that third base vacancy for the Brewers. I guess I can start with this one. We'll get to our offseason plans in a little bit. I actually have him listed as part of my offseason plan, but I'm not necessarily a big Yoan Moncada guy. But as I'll talk about more when we get into what we did with our plans, the options are pretty thin for the Brewers in free agency. And again, I'm not a big believer in him necessarily. He's had a very inconsistent career so far. But he does have that former highly regarded prospect pedigree. That's a profile that the Brewers have liked to take gambles on. I shouldn't necessarily lump those all into one profile because there are different guys who were once highly regarded for varying reasons. It's not always the exact same guy that they're picking up, but they like to pick up some of these guys who have kind of that post-hype prospect status. So he would fall into that camp. I also think he's at least a little bit interesting because there's like no power on this infield market, like none outside of, the marquee guys like Willy Adames, Alex Bregman, and Christian Walker, and Pete Alonso, if you're going to count him kind of in that mix, even though he should probably be more of a DH. There's just nothing there. So if you're looking for a guy who could maybe not fill the Willy Adames power void, but help a little bit, this probably is a guy who has at least shown the ability to get to 20 home runs before. It was several years ago, and he kind of settled into more of the, I think, like the 12 to 15 home run range in the years after that. But we've at least seen that from him before. So I ended up kind of having to pick him when I weighed all the different factors that are going into what's available for the Brewers, what they need, and also some of the other moves that I made as I was trying to manage payroll and all that stuff, because the Brewers are probably going to be on a tight budget. I think he is a pretty realistic option at the very least.
Yeah, I agree. I think I would pretty much echo everything you said. He wouldn't be at the top of my list in a, non-budget world where I don't have to worry about those types of things. He's not my favorite player. But I think there is a ceiling here that you're not getting from too many guys. It's still a relatively young player who still has probably a little bit of growth potential. And it's a guy who's been hurt a lot the last few years, and especially this past season, where you're hoping you get a healthier version of him. You get him back to that season he had a few years ago where he did put up pretty solid power numbers that would have put him in the middle of the Brewers lineup last year if you were putting them up for them. So he's played solid defense at third base. Although, if I remember right, I don't have it up right now. He's kind of gone like up and down, hasn't he? Or am I misremembering?
Yeah, he's been inconsistent defensively at third base, but he's out of the guys who are out there. Again, there's also not a lot of guys who are premium defenders at third base either. So I think that he's maybe not at the top of the list there, but I would say you could do a lot worse than him defensively. Like there are some guys, as I was looking through this market, like I don't know if they even can play third base. They're infielders. So in theory, you would think they could, but they just don't profile very well there at all for varying reasons. Sometimes it's lack of a strong throwing arm seems to be a big one. That's kind of a theme on this market, especially when you get into the territory of like Brewers-y type players, like players who could fit the budget. So yeah, I think defensively, I wouldn't really worry about it in terms of how that impacts the fit.
Yeah. So, I mean, overall, I think it would be, well, not my first choice or maybe even my second. Like, I think if the Brewers signed Yoan Moncada, I would understand it and I'd be fine with it. I think there would be plenty of reason to do it. I think it could make sense for them depending on how the rest of the offseason shakes out and everything else, but definitely would not have an issue with it. I think there's legitimacy to like his fit. I think he could make some sense for the Brewers for sure.
When I think of him, and especially as I was basically forced to think of him more as I was putting all my stuff together, this would actually remind me a little bit of when the Brewers signed Avi Garcia. It's not a perfect comparison because he was coming off a point in his career where he was at least somewhat healthy and could command a multi-year deal, like the 2-year deal the Brewers signed him to. It wasn't a crazy deal or anything, but it was multiple years. You could probably get Moncada for a 1-year deal for hopefully a decent chunk under 10 million because he only played like 40 games in 2024. It wasn't a lot, but it is kind of similar. They're at similar ages. Moncada just played his age 29 season. I believe the Brewers signed Garcia going into his age 29 season. But again, guys who had that former top prospect, pretty toolsy pedigree, have a little bit of pop. Garcia always hit the ball harder than Moncada has. But I still see a little bit of a similarity here just in the sense of kind of the reputation that these guys have had, the way their careers have gone too, the up and down, like almost every other year, alternating between a pretty solid season and then just a very bad season after that. Garcia had the same deal. So I could see this happening, and I could see it kind of being the Brewers giving that kind of deal another opportunity, except in this instance, it would probably be a 1-year. But yeah, I do think he is definitely a name to note as we talk about filling that third base hole. Another question from Mason. He asked us about potentially trading Devin Williams to the Phillies with Tyler Black for Alec Bohm. I'll let you kind of take the lead on this one first. What do you think of that?
I guess my first instinct is to think that might be more than the Brewers would need to give up for Bohm. I don't know that Black would need to be included in that type of deal. I know that Bohm, technically, he has 2 years left. Williams has 1. But I think overall that Devin would carry more value right now. I know Bohm's coming off a good year. I'm not the biggest believer in his profile. My guess would be that most of baseball isn't either. I don't mind him as a player. I think he's honestly somewhat similar to Moncada in a lot of ways across the board. I don't think he had a better year defensively this year. I'm not sure I buy that. I don't think he's a great defender. That's basically eye test, but also just prior to this year, he had never really shown it. So I don't know if I buy that jump. I think it might just be a little bit fluky. And the bat's never been as good as it was last year either. So I think you're kind of if you're doing that, you're buying high on him if you're giving up Black and Devin. But I think the idea of like Devin for Bohm in as like the centerpiece to a trade makes some sense for both teams. I can definitely see the Phillies wanting a guy like Devin Williams. That makes a lot of sense for them given what they ran out at closer the last couple of years. They've been putting the ghost of Craig Kimbrell out there and anything else they can throw out there. And they found some solid production last year in their bullpen out of surprise names. But I think for a team that really wants to contend for a World Series, has the budget they have, has the investment they've put into all their players, he makes a lot of sense. There's some other teams like that too that we'll get to when we go through our plans, but like he makes sense for the Phillies. There's a fit of sorts for Bohm with the Brewers, just given the third base situation and everything else. I've never been a huge fan of Bohm. I don't love the profile, like I said, and I'm just not sure I would want him in general. And I definitely don't think I would be a fan of a Devin and Tyler Black for Alec Bohm trade, I guess, if I'm looking at it just from that perspective. But yeah, Jack, I mean, I guess, what are your thoughts on it? Do you think that's an overpay? Do you think that would be a reasonable deal? And what are your thoughts on Bohm in general?
I think if you're looking just at like wins above replacement type value and you're stripping a lot of the context out of it, I think it looks pretty fair.
Yeah.
Because you're taking an elite reliever for a guy who's kind of a iffy but probably everyday caliber position player, and that's a guy who's hopefully playing upwards of 140 games for you. Like, it probably comes out as a wash.
Mm-hmm.
So from that standpoint, it makes some sense. But you mentioned how you'd be buying high on Bohm if you put Black in that deal. You're buying high on him no matter what, I think. If just by trading for him, you are buying high on him. This is a guy who is essentially a replacement level player for the first couple of years of his career, and it was largely because of the defense. You talked about the defense. It wasn't just bad before this year. It was terrible. Like, he was borderline unplayable at third base for the first several years of his career. Like, there were discussions about the Phillies potentially having to move him to first base, and he did end up playing a lot of first base when Rhys Hoskins was injured. So I'm not buying the defense either. We know that defensive metrics can be a little bit imperfect from season to season. I think if you see huge swings in one direction or the other, it usually means something happened. So he probably did get a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
But knowing the track record, I don't think he suddenly improved from god awful over there to okay. I would say he's still a bad defensive third baseman. He probably made the jump from borderline unplayable to just bad over there now. And we'll talk about this as we keep talking about the third base market. If the Brewers go the free agent route, they are going to have to come to terms with the fact that they're probably not getting a great defensive third baseman. They are going to take a hit defensively at that position. But I would argue it's probably going to come out as a wash anyway, because Willy Adames was not a good shortstop last year, and you're sliding Joey Ortiz over to that position. And if you're going to take plus defense at one of those two spots, it's shortstop.
Yes.
No questions asked there. But Alec Bohm is on a completely different level in terms of how bad he has often been in the field. Offensively, I think he's fine. He kind of reminds me a little bit of like a Mike Moustakas with less power. Like, Mike Moustakas was, I know he was a fan favorite, but for the large portion of his career, even in 2018 when he came to the Brewers down the stretch that year, he was not really a great hitter. He was just a solid hitter. He was like a little bit above the league average, which is fine. That's what the Brewers needed at that point. Probably the best year of his career was that 2019 season when he came back. That was really the only year in his career where, if you go back and look, that jumps out as he was actually a really, really solid, more than solid, like a good hitter that year. But other than that, he kind of had that profile where it was like, I know fans really gravitated toward him. It seemed like he always came up with big hits. But at the end of the day, it was really nothing to write home about necessarily, but there's value in it. I think Bohm is kind of similar. He doesn't have the same level of power. We're not going to see him hit 38 home runs in a year. or however many Moustakas did that 1 year in Kansas City, where he really went nuts in the power department, but everything else was a little iffy. But I don't think he makes a whole lot of sense for the Brewers specifically, especially if the defense really is that bad.
Yeah.
And he's only got 2 more years of control. My guess is the Brewers are probably going to be thinking a little bit more long term than that. You know, you look at the kind of moves that they've made. The Josh Hader trade, they picked up someone with a fresh set of club control in Robert Gasser, even though some other guys in that deal were closer to free agency. Corbin Burns deal, they picked up DL Hall and Joey Ortiz, who had fresh sets of club control. I kind of have a hard time seeing them going a different route with Devin Williams and trading for a guy who's, how old is Bohm? 28. He's only got a couple of years left. It would be a little different, I think, and it would not necessarily feel like a Brewers move to me. So I'm not going to rule it out. And again, I think if you just take a lot of that context out and you just look at how valuable each of these two players have been to their two teams, particularly in 2024, and I guess for Devin Williams, you got to kind of extrapolate that to a full season. I think it seems like an even exchange. I just don't know if it's going to be something that the Brewers necessarily think makes the most sense for them. So unless you have any more thoughts on that, we can kind of move forward a little bit. Patrick asked us a question about some bounce back candidates, buy low types that you think the Brewers may have interest in. I can go first with this one. So this is not somebody who was on either one of our offseason plans, but I honestly think that this is the guy who is probably among the most likely to end up playing a lot of third base for the Brewers in 2025. I would say Josh Rojas. He was recently non-tendered by the Seattle Mariners. I don't even mind him that much as a player. I actually think that he's got a chance to be like a very sneaky role player for whichever team picks him up, because he's got largely pretty good plate discipline. He's got an elite chase rate. The walk rate was nothing to write home about in 2024, but I'd be willing to bet that the underlying chase rate being really good means we can probably see that increase, especially if the actual hit tool kind of bounces back a little bit. He was a below average hitter in 2024, and a lot of his production was really just within the first month or so of the season, and then he really struggled the rest of the way. But he's got a little bit more pop than someone like Bryce Terang or Sal Frelick. He's got the lower bat speed like those guys, but he's already hitting the ball harder than both of them with similar bat speed. So that would tell you that he's stronger than these guys. We've seen him, I believe, get into the double digits for home runs before. I think he hit 11 a few years ago when he was with the Diamondbacks. He had a couple of years with the Diamondbacks where he was an above average hitter. So you pair that with the versatility that he provides. He'd probably play a lot of third base for the Brewers. He played mostly third base for Seattle in 2024, where he really turned into a very good defender over there. And I know we just had the discussion with Bohm before. This is an instance of a guy who basically went from like a so-so defender to now having a really good defensive season at one position that he finally kind of got to anchor down at. So I think I buy that a little bit more. So you have a good defender who does not chase. He just seems like kind of that scrappy guy that Pat Murphy likes. Like if the Brewers were to sign Josh Rojas, I could very easily see Pat Murphy raving about him for the entirety of spring training. I think he's a very Brewers-like player. And I think there's a very good chance based on that the Brewers end up with him. And again, I like him as a player. I actually like him as a player more than some other guys who I ended up looking at more closely for my offseason plan. The holdup for me and the sticking point for me is the Brewers have so many of these kinds of guys. These scrappy, good defenders who are not going to hit for a lot of power. And the Brewers really need power guys, especially now that Willy Adames is gone. So that's really the sticking point for me. I just don't know if that's quite the best use of their resources. Josh Rojas, I think he keeps your floor decently high. Like, to me, he's another one of these players where the floor is like always going to be okay. Even if he doesn't hit a lot, the floor is still okay because he's that good defender and because he's going to grind out at bats. He's going to see pitches. He's not going to chase. He's not going to give in. But is that really what the Brewers need right now? I feel like this team has a pretty high floor going into 2025. I think what they need more are guys who maybe are a little bit riskier, but they have the ability to give you more if things break right. And I think that's something I tried to keep in mind when I was going through and trying to develop my plan. But kind of discounting what I think and just trying to think about what the Brewers might be looking at, I do think he's a guy who they are probably going to take a long and serious look at and would have some interest in signing. I think at the very least, he's a very safe option that you can go after in a market that is just not great at a position where the Brewers have a pretty big need.
Yeah, no, I read your article about him. There's a lot of Brewer in that profile, just a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And it definitely makes some sense. In fact, I looked at it for my plan after reading your article because I was like, that actually makes some sense. But I kind of went, not for the same reasons, but I went a different direction for my own reasons, which we'll get into when we talk about it. But yeah, I looked into this, and there's not a ton of names that like jump out to me. I think one that's pretty popular in MLB circles right now, partially because Mike Petriello wrote about him, is Mike Soroka from the White Sox. It's a guy who really struggled in the rotation for the White Sox last year. They moved him to the pen, and it went extremely well. He dealt with some more injuries like he has pretty much his entire career, which is maybe a helpful thing when you're looking at what he's going to get in terms of money on the market. But Petriello wrote a great article about it. I'm not going to just recite everything he talked about here and go all the way through it again, but he made some pretty nice changes to his velo jumped when he moved to the pen. Some of the stuff was moving a little differently, but he also really just started striking people out at an insane rate in the bullpen. After moving there, he ended up with a 39% strikeout rate out of the pen. That was second highest in all of baseball behind Mason Miller for relievers who faced at least 150 batters. My thing would be I would want the Brewers to move him back to the rotation if they do sign him here. I would want him to be, or at least get a chance to pitch in the rotation. I think if you can kind of carry over some of the changes he made and stick him into a role that's probably more along the lines of like what we saw from Jacob Junis and Joe Ross when they were starting, like you're not asking him to go more than 2 times through the order very often. But I think he could perform in that role with the repertoire he has. And like I said, this isn't really going out on a limb. This is something that's probably going to be a wide held belief by probably a lot of teams and a lot of fans. And like I said, Petriello's article really put it on the map, but he's the guy that kind of stands out to me as like, that's a Brewers-ish target. And I think they would probably want him to, they would probably honestly be taking a very similar approach to what they did with Joe Ross last year. Just somebody who hasn't been able to stay very healthy, former top prospect as a pitcher, and a guy who was pitching in shorter stints the past year and performed better, and they thought they could maybe make it into a starter repertoire. So he's kind of the name that stands out for me. I don't have any bats. I just really struggled to find anybody that stood out on the offensive side.
I would say for bats, Jorge Polanco is an interesting one because I think the bat feels like a potential Brewers bounce back target. I'm not sure where you put him in the field.
Yeah.
Because he's always been a bad defensive infielder. And now he's coming off knee surgery. Could you put him at third base? Maybe. For a moment, weighed doing it in my offseason plan, and then I looked into it more. I'm like, I don't think he can play third base. And again, we're talking like he would be awful there. So like that's a tricky one too, because it would in a way kind of remind me of the opportunity the Brewers tried to take on Jesse Winker
I was just gonna
A
say that.
knee surgery is not nearly as serious as what Winker went through, but it's still a pretty pivotal joint in all of your movements. Like, you have to have your lower body under you. And I do think his throwing arm would probably be better after he comes back from that procedure. Because if you're not able to throw with your lower body under you, like, yeah, your arm strength is going to go down the tank. But he's never had a great arm to begin with. So it's kind of iffy to me whether he could hold his own at third base. I don't know. If he can, I think all of a sudden then he becomes a pretty good target for him. But like, that's kind of the sticking point for me. And that's ultimately part of the reason why I ended up leaving him out. But otherwise, again, another guy who has shown an ability to hit for some power before. That he's a switch hitter, so that gives you more flexibility in the lineup. That's the benefit to Moncada as well, who we talked about a few minutes ago. He's a switch hitter, and that's also one of the sticking points with Rojas is he's a left-handed hitter that forces the Brewers to find a right-handed counterpart to play third base with him. Seattle heavily platooned him because they just did not believe in his ability to hit lefties, and they were largely correct in making that assumption or holding that belief. But that's the thing. If you bring in Josh Rojas, it changes the dynamic of kind of that lefty-righty balance in the infield because Adames was a right-handed bat. And now it also puts you in a spot where you need to find a platoon partner for him at third base. I don't want it to be Andre Monasterio. I don't want it to be Vidi Capra. I don't, like, if there's a guy who probably has a case for getting some fleeting third base at bats, it's probably Oliver Dunn, but that's also another lefty. So Rojas does kind of open up that can of worms as well. Yeah. So it'd be nice to see him get a right-handed bat. I think Gio Urshela might be a guy that they could end up with too at third base. And I guess now we're kind of dipping into another question as well. So I'm going to just throw this one out there so that he knows that we're addressing it. Marcus asked us about, free agent trade market targets who could take over at shortstop or third base. So we talked about maybe Polanco. I don't know. We talked about maybe Rojas. I think Rojas probably fits better than Polanco because of the defense. But again, like, if Polanco all of a sudden does look like someone who can be a passable third baseman, I would much rather go after him. We talked about Moncada. I think Gio Urshela as well, just as a guy who is okay defensively at third base. Not a great bat, but you kind of know what you're getting with him. You're probably going to get like your 90 OPS plus. Can probably get on base at a decent rate because he's always hit for an okay batting average. Doesn't walk a ton, but hits for an okay batting average. It's not going to give you a lot of power. That's kind of just what I see up and down this market a lot. And Urshela's probably got one of the higher floors out of some of these guys. So I would say he's probably an option as well. Again, kind of double dipping on some questions here. But one of the last ones we'll take here is also for Marcus. He said, other than Devin Williams, who are some other potential players to be moved by the Brewers this offseason? Any dark horse candidates? Do you want to start?
Yeah.
If you have anyone in mind.
Well, yeah, I think, and we've mentioned this on other podcasts, but I do think Aaron Savali is a very real candidate to get moved. I don't know how much of a dark horse candidate fans consider him. I think some people thought he might get non-tendered. I don't think that was I never thought that was really on the table. But I have always thought a trade was possible, and I do continue to think that, and we'll see when we get to our offseason plans that both of us did end up moving him in those. I guess the dark horse part always throws me off because I don't know what other people think of guys necessarily, but like, I really do think Tyler Black's getting moved one way or another this offseason. I don't want to like guarantee it, which I basically just did, but it just feels like there's no room for him on this roster, and it's going to be really hard to find it at any time in the near future. Like you just talked about, Jack, it'd be another left-handed bat. It's a guy who's struggling to find any position to play defensively outside of a corner outfield spot, which that's not a problem for the Brewers right now, filling outfield spots, especially with left-handed bats. So it's just really hard for me to see a path to him having an opportunity with the Brewers. And in that case, it feels like he's going to get moved. So those are the ones. I don't know, maybe another dark horse would be like a Piams type of guy, which nobody really talked about. Everyone kind of thought, oh, now that he's tendered, he's a Brewer, but he still could get traded. I mean, those are the types of guys I guess I would look at from the active roster, like a Savali and a Piamps, but Black is my main one.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this before. You do still have the ability to option Tyler Black, and I know that's something we've talked about a lot for sure with the outfield prospects, or I guess they're not
Yeah.
prospects anymore. People talk about this logjam. You can option some of these guys if you need to, so you're not as boxed in as you think you are. And we've talked about this. It's true to an extent with Tyler Black. So I don't think their backs are necessarily against the wall. But number
No.
one, you do run the risk of, does any trade value he has can continue to go down? But number two, he's so limited in what he can give you in terms of, he can only play first base. Well, he probably shouldn't even be playing there. He's mainly a DH. He can play some outfield, but he's behind a lot of guys on the depth chart. Left-handed bat. I very much still believe he has the potential to be a productive player, but
Yeah.
he just does not provide a lot of utility to the Brewers the way this organization's constructed. So when you have guys like these toolsy, speedy outfielders that the Brewers have, if you were in a position where you really needed to option one, you could. And then guess what? If something happens, you can call that guy back up and you have all your depth. Tyler Black is in a spot where something could happen to the big league team, and Tyler Black is not getting called back up because he doesn't, most likely, unless there's an injury to Rhys Hoskins, he's probably not giving you what you need to replace. So when you think about it that way, even if Tyler Black is, optioned and they're using the option, he's spending time in Nashville, the Brewers might see that as kind of a waste of a 40-man spot because, yes, you have the flexibility to option him, but if you never really have a good opportunity to promote him again, he's just sitting on that 40-man roster without really helping you a lot. Versus if you were to send down somebody else who has just more ways that they can impact the game, more positions at which they can impact the game, that's a little bit different because their value on the 40-man roster is, even if they're not with us, we know that if we're in a pinch, we can call this guy up and he's going to fill some needs. It's not really the case with Tyler Black. So I do wonder if that might be part of the incentive as well, if the Brewers really do push the button with him as opposed to some of these other guys that they've kept in the past when it didn't seem like there was an obvious place for them to play on the big league team. So something to keep in mind when we're talking about Tyler Black's future, because it is very much up in the air right now. So we'll see what happens over these next few months. I agree with you, though. I do think he's getting moved. I didn't end up moving him in my offseason plan just because, well, we'll actually get to that pretty soon here. I'll go through my little ramble about this. But I do think he's someone who's very much on the trade block. I would think it's more likely that he gets moved than otherwise, I think is kind of the way to wrap that up and the way to sum it up.
Yeah.
But now that we have that out of the way, some of these questions as well that we were asked this week, we didn't take all of them in this section, but they will kind of crop up as we go through how we chose to build the 2025 Brewers in our offseason plans. So this was Spencer's idea. He said it would be a fun little exercise for us. My little perspective on this is that it is not a fun exercise. I know this is how most people like to have fun over the offseason. They like to put their plan together. They like to make their trades. They like to make their signings. I hate doing this. There are very few things, very few tasks associated with my job that I hate more than having to do all this stuff. Not because I don't think it's not valuable. Like, it's good to think about this stuff a little bit. Like, I'm not saying I don't pay any attention to it. You'll see me put stuff out about, hey, the Brewers should look into this guy. Here's a guy who might be a fit. But I'm looking at like some guys in isolation, or I'm looking at this guy specific to just one section of the roster and how he fits that portion of the roster. When you do it as a whole like this, number one, you're trying to be one person doing the job of God knows how many people in the front office. But the portion of this that I think I hate the most, and I've talked about this before, is trying to put together trades. I hate doing it. I think it is an exercise in futility unless you're Spencer Michaelis and you have like crazy galaxy brain knowledge of every farm system in Major League Baseball. But even then, I don't think it's a great use of time because trades are different. You don't know for sure what every team is looking for. Projecting a prospect is way different than trying to break down a known commodity in a big league player. You don't know how any organization is valuing any player. Like you look back a couple years ago, the Athletics were sold on Esteury Ruiz as being the only guy they needed to get from Milwaukee in that 3-team trade. Nobody would have assumed that. But it can go both ways. You can put together a package where you think this seems fair, but you don't know what the other team is thinking. You don't know what the Brewers are thinking. To me, there's so many things that you don't know that make it very, very challenging to put together something realistic. And even if you've put together something that you think seems realistic, it may not end up being the case. So I'm a stickler for wanting to put out things that are reasonable and right or close to right as often as possible. I'm not saying I always do that because that's impossible to do. But I think that this is the area where you are least likely to arrive at something like that. So I don't like putting that much mental energy into it. But for the sake of this exercise, because we really have nothing else to do right now, it's the first week of December. This is like the dead spot of the offseason. I obliged, and I put together an offseason plan. It was a painstaking process. I'm still not 100% proud of it. If I had to like gauge my pride level in my offseason plan, it's maybe like 70%, like a 7 out of 10. And that's usually for most things. If I've done analysis on a player or written a draft about something or whatever, or pitched an idea for a podcast episode, if I'm at a 7 out of 10 in terms of my confidence level in it, I won't publish it. But in this instance, I had no choice. So now that I have all that out of the way, Spencer, would you like to go first?
I would love to go first, Jack. I have to give Jack credit. He went along with our little plan here. He was not happy about it. He made it very clear that he wasn't happy about it. I think I said last episode, Jack, that Jack just does not deal in hypotheticals. That's not something he enjoys doing, which is fine. There's plenty of reason for that. I understand it. All I need to know from the listeners, and I want to make sure this is clear, and I need you guys to all follow through on this. If Jack gets any contract like remotely wrong or something just ends up not making any sense by the end of the offseason, please revisit this and yell at him because that's his biggest fear on these things. He doesn't want to.
No, I told you I don't. I told you I don't care if the listeners come back and yell at me. The problem is I won't be able to live with myself knowing that I projected something so poorly. Especially because it was something that I don't even have not any confidence, but not a lot of confidence in my ability to project it relative to other things that I look at.
Fine. I will let you have that. I promise you no one cares, Jack. It'll be fine. You don't need to worry about it.
I know, either, but I care. This is the problem. I can't get past it. So I'm not blaming anybody else here. I'm saying this is an internal struggle.
All right, fair enough.
Now it's being that internal struggle is being projected to the audience because I had to do this. Yes, it is. So really, you're the one. I guess you're the one to blame here. Both of us are to blame a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, I am not taking full blame for you having too much of a putting too much blame on yourself, but it's all right. We'll move forward. And if we want to start, we could just start with my free agent moves. That's probably the easiest way to get going here. We were operating. So first of all, I guess we should plug the tool on Brewer Fanatic. There is a payroll tool, an off-season plan tool on brewerfanatic.com. You should check it out. It's very easy to use. There's plenty of people who have been putting up their plans already. It's a fun little tool. It gives you a budget of 130 million. Jack and I both kind of agreed that was probably too high for what we expect the Brewers to be operating at. So ours ended up being more in the 110 range. We were thinking probably 115 is probably a pretty fair budget to work under. So just keep that in mind as we go through it. But just kicking things off with my free agent additions. The first one, I'm starting with a starting pitcher, and some of this will make a little bit more sense when we get to the trades. Obviously, an actual offseason, things will happen in a certain order. We're just going to go free agency and then trades and go from there. But the main one here, and I think the biggest contract I would be handing out, is to Spencer Turnbull, who he was a Phillies pitcher this year. He had spent time with the Tigers in the past. This is a guy who he's really performed the last few years when he's been on the field, when he's been able to take the mound. There have been some pretty big health issues for him. I don't believe he has cracked 100 innings in maybe ever, but for sure not in the last few years while he has been putting up solid numbers. He started in the rotation for the Phillies last year. He got hurt, and then he ended up pitching out of the pen a little bit more after he came back, and then he got hurt again. So I'd be handing out a 1-year, $7 million contract, which is what MLB Trade Rumors basically projected is about $7 million for him. That's kind of how I based most of my numbers, or at least tried to use that as a measuring stick. Like Jack said, it's all hypothetical. We really don't know what they're going to get.
Well, here's the problem with that. A lot of the guys who you're trying to fit in this budget for the Brewers are not going to be on that list. So you don't have any contract projections for him. You have to try to think of it yourself. So it's like,
but you can go to the bottom of that list and see, okay, that's where that's, maxing out. And now I'm working below that for these guys. That's how I based it. But yes, you are correct. There wasn't a 1-to-1 comparison I could use for some of these guys. Anyway, I added a $10 million mutual option for 2026 with a $1.5 million buyout. So basically I'm guaranteeing $8.5 million to Turnbull, moving the money around a little bit because that's what the Brewers do. And I'm trying to be realistic. I don't know if that makes that much sense or not, but it's a little more fun and it makes it feel a little bit more like a real transaction. But really in the end, this is a guy that I would want starting games. And again, I don't know if you're even getting 100 innings out of him, but I do think when you get him on the mound, you're probably getting pretty good production. He had a 2.65 ERA in his 54 innings with the Phillies this year. The FIP was more in that mid threes, upper threes. Nothing too crazy, but 26% strikeout rate, only a 9% walk rate. And it's a guy with 6 pitches. It's a guy who throws the fastball and the sinker, which the Brewers tend to like guys with multiple fastballs. He's got variations of the slider. He's got the slider and the sweeper. He's got a curveball and he's got a changeup. It's mostly 4-seam, sweeper, and sinker. Those are probably the 3 highest used pitches for him. But he can mix everything in. There's a little bit of an Aaron Savali type of repertoire minus the changeup or minus the cutter here. It's just kind of somebody that I like as Brewers fit. I think he makes some sense. I think there's going to be similar to last year, kind of a rotating back end of the rotation where you're seeing a bunch of different arms kind of file through there. That would be my guess. And I think when Turnbull's healthy, he would be a good option for that type of role. So he's my biggest free agent, which probably isn't super exciting to people, but that's how it's going to go. I would be somewhat surprised if the Brewers had a bigger signing than someone in that single digits for millions. I don't know that you'll see anybody over 10. That would surprise me a little bit. My second biggest one, this is somebody who it's a little interesting when you see my final roster, but I just think John Birdie, who has been a Marlin for most of his career, but was traded to the Yankees last year. I'm giving him 1 year, $4.5 million. It's a guy who's played everywhere on the diamond, literally every spot other than catcher. For me, it's almost like a better version of Hernan Perez. He's held his own defensively at every infield spot. He made an ALCS start at first, which he had never started at first base in his MLB career. But that kind of gives an idea of how versatile he is and how much trust the Yankees were willing to put in him, putting him at first base in that type of situation. I think he's somebody that just gives the Brewers a lot of options. He's played all 3 outfield spots. Center's the only one he hasn't really done well at, and I don't think you'd ever see him in center for the Brewers. They have plenty of options to cover that spot, but it just gives you versatility. Like we saw Andrew Monasterio play first base. We saw him play some outfield last year. I think this is just a big time upgrade over that. It's a guy who still has 90th percentile sprint speed, even though I think he's 34 next year. He'll be 34 for next season. He hits a lot of line drives, not huge power or anything, but I like him as a player more than Monasterio, more than anybody that's been filing through in that utility role. And I think he gives the most versatility of any of those guys too. Like I think there's a lot of options for him. So he was a guy I would target. I think the Brewers will at least take a look at him. We know they looked at Isaiah Kiner-Falefa last year, who had somewhat similar type of profile. So I think he's somebody they'll take a peek at. I also went with a reliever, and this one's almost, I would view it as almost like a non-guaranteed contract, but it's an arm I've always liked a lot. Lucas Sims, he spent most of his career the last few years with the Cincinnati Reds, somebody that I've wanted the Brewers to get for a long time, and that's the main reason I'm going for this, because he's finally a free agent. He's finally available. 1 year, $1.5 million. Like I said, it's almost a non-guaranteed deal. Jack reminded me of the Urania contract that the Brewers gave out right before the season started a couple of years ago, a couple of years ago. It kind of reminds me of that, but this is a guy who's got good stuff, like a nasty breaking ball with his sweeper. He throws a bunch of different breaking balls. He's got a four-seam and a cutter, and everything grades out well. Like all of his pitches grade out well. He has struggled with command, especially last year. He had a really solid season a couple of years ago, but he was not good last year. It was a 4.38 ERA, but it was a 5.23 FIP. Like he walked 14% of hitters. He didn't strike out that many. I just think there's a big bounce back candidate in the arm. I probably could have listed him, honestly, when we had that question earlier, but he's the type of guy who I think could bounce back into being like a guy I would give some high leverage outings to with the type of stuff he has. They would have to clean up some stuff, especially with the command, but I've always been a huge fan of him. He reminded me of like Ryan Presley before he went to Houston, where it was like, wow, this guy has really good stuff, and he just hasn't put it together yet. He's always kind of given me that type of vibe. So that would be what I would be shooting for there. And he would kind of fill out my last spot in the bullpen, which is going to be open when I get to my trades. And then I do have one minor league deal, Chris Flexen. I don't know if he's a minor league type of signing or not. I gave him $1.5 million if he ends up in MLB. He actually kind of had a similar season to Soroka with the White Sox, where he really struggled as a starter. He actually pitched pretty well out of the pen for a couple weeks. They moved him back to the rotation, and he was solid the rest of the year. I don't know what his value is, to be honest, but he feels like the type of guy that the Brewers would take a flyer on. Good breaking ball. He's got really high induced vertical break, but he throws from a pretty high release, so it doesn't play up as much on the fastballs. But somebody that I think could hold his own at the back of a rotation, give you starts where he keeps you in games. The type of guy you want as like a AAA depth type of pitcher. So he's my last one for the free agents. And the main thing with this roster that's going to come into the fold is that a lot of this is filled out by trade. And it's only 2 trades, but it kind of really puts the roster together. So the first one is a Devin Williams trade. It is Devin moving to the New York Yankees. Anyone who watched the playoffs saw, Luke Weaver had a fantastic season for the Yankees, but they did struggle in the back of their pen. He also had to be used constantly in the playoffs for them to be able to get through it. I think they're going to be looking for like that lockdown closer. I talked about it when we talked about Bohm. It's a team that's got a ton of money invested, a team that was just in the World Series. It's a team that wants to win, and a lockdown closer just gives you that peace of mind when you get to that 9th inning that they would probably really like to have. So I think it makes sense for them. On the Brewers side of things, they would be receiving Will Warren, a right-handed pitcher who made his debut this year with the Yankees. Rock Reggio, who the Brewers actually drafted out of high school, but he ended up signing and going to Oklahoma State. So I know they have interest, or they've had interest in him in the past. And then Sabier Marte, another right-handed pitching prospect, a little bit of a younger guy with pretty interesting stuff. Big body, 6'5", lanky guy who's got some projection left. Warren would be kind of the main piece for me here. I think this is a legitimate starting profile, somebody who I think could fight for the 5th spot. And when we get to our final roster, you'll kind of see that. But I would give him a chance to potentially make starts this year. He's got the 4-seam fastball, which has solid. It's not a great pitch in terms of characteristics. It's only sitting around 94. 15 induced vertical break. Vertical approach angle is about negative 4.6. So it plays fine. It plays pretty well at the top of the zone, but it can get hit, especially if he's leaving it in less than ideal situations or spots in terms of the zone. Another guy with a really, really good sweeper. Very not surprising considering what the Yankees do with sweepers. They tend to be at the forefront of giving pitchers really solid sweepers. They were kind of first to the sweeper revolution, I guess. I mean, they were ahead of a lot of other teams in that regard. He throws a sinker. He throws a cutter. The cutter's more sliderish to me. I don't know. It's classified as a cutter. I think it's a little bit more short slider. It might even be 2 different pitches. There's a pretty wide range in the velo from what I've seen, but either way, looks like he's got the 3 fastball approach that the Brewers like. He's got the sweeper. He has a changeup. Changeup grades out pretty well too. He really struggled in his major league debut. Again, not walks, but I think command in the zone wasn't necessarily great in his first 22 innings. I like him as an arm. I don't think he's like an ace ever, but I think he's the type of guy who could fight to be a solid 3 in a rotation or something in the future. I talked about Rizzo already. I'm not going to get into it too much, but it's an infielder. It's a guy with some pop, especially for his frame. Not a big dude. Jack kind of hinted at this, but he just feels like a guy Murph would love. It's a scrappy 5'9" guy who does have power. Like he can hit probably pretty close to 20 homers at some point. He's gotten like Dustin Pedroia comps when he was in college. He's not that, but Scooter Jeanette type of player, I could see that type of player in Rock Regio. Like that wouldn't shock me. And then Sabia Marte, like I said, it's a good fastball already. He's 6'5". He only weighs 170 pounds. He walked too many people in, I believe he was in the FCL, which is the Florida Complex League. And then he's got a pretty solid changeup that grades out as better than average, according to Baseball America. And his slider also grades out better than average. Like I said, command wasn't great this year, but it's been said most evaluators think it's going to be solid in the future. It gives me like Bishop Letson vibes, who the Brewers already have, but taking another chance on those types of arms, never would complain about that. So that's my first trade. And then my second trade is with the Royals. And this is where the Brewers get their third baseman. I haven't addressed third base yet. I don't want John Birdie being the starting third baseman. I think he'd be fine. I think he could hold his own there if you needed to do that. He's played good defense there. But the Brewers are getting Michael Garcia from the Royals, and I'll get into him in a minute. The surface level stats last year were not very good. I do like Garcia a lot. The Royals are getting Aaron Savali and Tyler Black. And again, I'm imagining some listeners probably don't love that idea. I'll say from the Royals' perspective why I did this. They're apparently looking for a back of the rotation starter, which Savali fits that type of mold. I did want to clear a little bit of space on the budget in general because I think they might need to in order to do everything else that I did. And I thought that Turnbull was kind of a solid replacement for Savali. So that was kind of where the whole logic flew in there. The Tyler Black part, I already went through it earlier. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I don't know. I already don't know that he has a ton of value right now. Every other team can kind of see where he is in the Brewers pecking order as well. The Brewers brought him up. They forced him into the lineup a couple times against righties, but even then, like when he was up, he wasn't playing regularly. Like, I just don't know what the plan is with him. And like Jack said, at some point, if he doesn't have a real path, there's not unlimited 40-man spots, and the Brewers like to have open 40-man spots, or at least 40-man spots they're willing to cycle through. So I'm viewing this as not necessarily selling low on him, but trying to get out before I think they might end up having to sell low on Tyler Black. And I think Tyler Black's going to hit. in the big leagues. I really do. I just don't know how that happens with the Brewers. With the Royals, though, they're looking for corner outfielders who have a patient approach and some hitability. And that's Tyler Black basically to a T. I do think he's a solid left fielder if he has to play out there. I really do think he could do it. That's the only spot I've ever thought he could play defensively is left field. So I can see it making some sense for them from that perspective. Now, the Garcia part is probably the part where everyone's a little confused because, again, if you look at the surface stats, they were not good. He had a 613 OPS last year. I get a lot of Joey Ortiz vibes from Garcia in general, like overall. He played really solid defense at third base. He's got a pretty strong arm, probably better than Ortiz's, actually. He's also played shortstop, I should note. He's played shortstop when Bobby Witt was out in the past. He's shown an ability to handle shortstop. It's not something I'd want him doing regularly, but it'd be another guy who can do it. He doesn't whiff. He doesn't chase. Oddly enough, he also doesn't walk much. I've had a hard time coming to a great conclusion on that. I think it's more that teams feel comfortable going after him currently and just kind of attacking him. So he'll have to be a little bit better than that. He takes a lot of called strikes. He'll probably have to be a little bit more aggressive. Again, that's Joey Ortiz like. But he's shown an ability to hit the ball hard. Jack, you wrote an article earlier this year about Sal Frelick and how just actively attempting to swing the bat harder could be helpful for him. I think there's some of that to Garcia as well. He's shown an ability to swing the bat a lot faster than he does on average. And whenever he has, he's hit the ball hard. He's had pretty good production on swings where he's been at 75 miles per hour or higher, but he averages 71. So it's a matter of, obviously some guys, you're getting your A swing off on pitches you want to hit and hittable pitches more often. So that has to be factored into that equation. But I do still think there's untapped potential in the bat. I think there's more homer power than he's shown. He hit 7 this year. I think part of that is always going to be playing in Kansas City is a big park. But I think there's more homer power in there for him, like 15. I don't know if I see 20 in there, but I think 15 is a legitimate outcome for him. And I think he's going to eventually walk more, and he's got decent speed. He can, he stole 37 bases last year. So it's another guy who can steal bases. It doesn't fit with what Jack talked about earlier, which is my one concern here is that I would like to have added power here. And I looked at Ryan McMahon a lot before doing this in a trade. And I don't know where that one's going to make much sense. And I don't know that the Rockies are smart enough to trade him. I just don't really think they're going to. So Garcia is the one I settled on. The other piece here is Carson Roccaforte. He's the guy I just really liked in the draft in 2023. He's been off to a decent start to his pro career. Nothing crazy, but I think he's a great defender and center with some power in the bat and decent hitability too. He's only been in pro ball for a year and a half. It's been solid numbers. It hasn't been bad. It hasn't been good. But he's a guy that I can kind of just see kind of outperforming. Pipeline has him number 28 in their system. I think he's probably better than that in my view. And the other part of it is that the Brewers do, while everyone talks about the major league depth in the outfield and everything else, which is legitimate, there's almost none in the minors right now. There's very few outfield prospects. You have Braylon Payne, the first round pick, Yoferi Rodriguez, Luis Lara kind of teetering on the edge of being a legitimate prospect. And then you have a guy like Jose Anderson who hasn't even played stateside. There's no one else in the system right now that's a legitimate outfield prospect. At least off the top of my head, I don't think there is. And if there is, there's one more or something. So there's very few. They're actually lacking in that regard right now. So it just makes sense to me to add some of that. They have tons of middle infield and infield prospects in the minors right now, but outfield, I think they're missing a little bit. So he's the secondary piece, helps make up a little bit for what might be perceived as an overpay on the Brewers side without that being factored in. But I think it probably would be looked at as an overpay by most people if this trade happened. I have pretty strong belief in Maikel Garcia. I have for a little while now. He was a guy I targeted in like fantasy leagues when I was looking into like sleeper picks the last couple of years, I like Maikel Garcia. I think he's 24 years old. He gives you the team control that Jack talked about as well earlier. It would be an interesting trade, but I think there's legitimate upside here, and that was what I was looking for. I wanted to find somebody who could provide some upside at the third base spot. So I talked for a while there. That was my whole plan. But Jack, you can do whatever you want here. You can jump into yours. Why don't we do that, and then we'll circle back when we get to the full rosters at the end here. So
Yeah, then we can kind of compare a little bit. So I got my angry rant out a few minutes ago, well, several minutes ago at this point. But I'll just kind of lay a couple things out here before I jump in. Like I said, if I had to rate my overall conviction behind how I put together this roster, I'd say probably somewhere in that 7 out of 10 range, which is a little bit lower usually than most of the stuff that I actually feel good enough about to put out there. But for the sake of the exercise, I went with it. And that's not to say that I feel terrible about this roster. I feel pretty good about the vast majority of it. There's just a couple things here and there that I think, for a variety of reasons, one of them being limited information, being one guy trying to put all this together, also being on a time crunch. I didn't have as much time as I probably would have liked to put this together. But I feel good about the majority of it. There's a couple things here and there that I think I probably could have done a better job of if I had more time and maybe had more people whispering in my ear about certain things. Again, like if you're trying to put a trade together, Matt Arnold's not scouting every guy that they're trying to get in the return. They have a whole team of scouts and analysts that do that. We're just one guy each trying to put all this together on our own. There were a couple of things that I think I learned too from this about how the Brewers are probably going to have to approach these next few weeks that I had thoughts about before, but I think those thoughts are a little bit more developed now. I think the big one that really stands out to me, we knew the third base market was not good. We knew the infield market in general was not good. But now, as I really not only scanned it, I had scanned it before, but now I tried looking closely at multiple guys. It seems like from Pat Murphy's comments so far that he prefers to play Joey Ortiz at shortstop and leave Bryce Terang at second base unless the Brewers sign a shortstop. I agree with him on that. I think that is by far the best way to go. I think Joey Ortiz profiles much better as a shortstop than Bryce Terang does. Terang could do it, but Joey Ortiz has a stronger arm. He's got more recent history playing shortstop as well. I think it just works better. And Terang is so good at second base that, if possible, I think you don't want to touch that. However, having looked at this market now, I think there is a greater chance than I'm comfortable with and that the Brewers might be comfortable with that they might have to move Bryce Terang to shortstop just because it opens up a couple more options for you for going after, or not even going after, having to settle with almost guys who probably can only play second base. Like if you go out and Brendan Rodgers kind of ends up being that right-handed bat that's available for you, yeah, you're probably going to have to put Bryce Terang at shortstop and leave Joey Ortiz at third. It's not perfect, but it's the way things are going to have to go. And the Brewers have done this before. They've been in spots where the market was not great, and they kind of just played the market, and they took what was out there for them without trying to force something into happening. And sometimes that means you're not going to have to go with, or you're not going to be able to go with plan A, plan B, or even plan C. And I think that this is a market, the more I look at it and the more I looked at it for this exercise, this is a market where I think that has a pretty good chance of playing out that way for the Brewers. So the more I look at this, like I don't want Bryce Terang to be the shortstop. I don't think the Brewers want Bryce Terang to be the shortstop. They may have to swallow that pill though, based on the way this all plays out, because there's a chance that, yeah, maybe they do end up with, Brendan Rodgers, who probably should only be playing second base because he doesn't have the arm strength for third, or Jorge Polanco, who is not a good infielder anywhere. And when you look at the sum of the parts, they may be better off with him at second base than at third base. I don't know. You have a lot to weigh there. So I do think that's something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is I don't think it really hits you until you start going through this. The Brewers probably do not have a lot of money to play with. And Spencer, I know you touched on this before. I agree with you. I don't think we're going to see a free agent signing or any acquisition really making over 10 million annually or even making 10 million annually. I think it's all going to be single digit annual value deals that they either sign guys to or acquire guys who are in that range. Because the Brewers can say whatever they want. They have not publicly expressed any intention to cut payroll. They've actually indicated that they think they're going to be okay to do whatever. Nothing crazy, obviously, but kind of keep operating as they normally do. The loss of that TV revenue, I think, is going to hit them no matter what they're saying publicly. So I really think that at the very least in the short term, you're going to have to get a little creative with how you're doing some things. But I think that those are really two things that stood out to me as I was going through it. And with that in mind, I guess this wasn't a completely useless exercise because I do think it kind of added some perspective to things. But with that in mind, we'll jump into what I did. We'll start first with free agents. So I have Yoan Moncada on here as the solution at third base. And like I mentioned before, this isn't really because I like Yoan Moncada. This is because I think it's just the right mix of affordability and power potential and passable defense at third base that probably is just going to end up working best for what the Brewers need. There are not a lot of good options out here. And, you know, I talked before about the Brewers having to get creative just a few seconds ago. I should have said this before as well, before I dove into this. Another takeaway I had is to fill third base. And it kind of ties into what I said before, but it's just good to lay it out as I'm talking about Moncada. To fill third base, the Brewers, if they're going to go this route of not moving Bryce Terang to shortstop, they are either going to have to really lean on the scouting department and they're going to have to swing some kind of trade for someone that we probably don't even have on our radars. Spencer, I know you talked about Maikel Garcia. He could be a guy. But the Brewers may have to swing a trade for some guy who kind of has that similar outlook that you talked about, like the similar ways in which you could see it working out, even though the production hasn't been there. But they might have to dig even deeper and go to some guy who's in some team's minor league system, who's overlooked, that quite frankly, neither one of us have the time or the resources to fully look into as conclusively and as fully as the Brewers do. So if they're going to fill third base, they're either going to have to make a really creative trade like that I don't think any of us are going to be able to predict, or they're just going to have to settle. And I'm not trying to discredit, these free agents who are on the market, but none of these guys, I don't think in the Brewers' eyes, are ideal solutions at third base. Like none of them, unless you're somehow re-signing Willy Adames or signing Alex Bregman. I don't think any of them are ideal solutions. So you're kind of just going to have to see how things go on the market, and the guy you end up with is kind of the guy you end up with. And I think that Yoan Moncada has a pretty good chance of being that guy. I think that just that combination, like I said, of he's not going to cost you a lot, and there is some power potential here, unlike Josh Rojas, and he's a switch hitter, so he gives you a little bit more flexibility on the rest of the roster. That's why I went with him. I had Jorge Polanco in this slot for like 90% of the time as I was filling this out. There's kind of this thought in the back of my head, like, man, where am I going to fit him in the field? But in terms of like I said, bounce back bats, I really would like him for the Brewers. I just wonder if the lack of a fit in the field is just going to be a deal breaker there. And I also wonder if he's still going to command a little bit more money than Moncada is, because Moncada's had the inconsistent year to year. Polanco, as bad as his 2024 was relative to what he was doing before, he still finished the year with like a 95 OPS plus. And this was after like 3 or 4 years where he was one of the better offensive second basemen in baseball. So my guess is he might command around 10 million or something. It depends on who's going after him and who sees him as a bounce back candidate. But I do wonder if he's going to go for more than Moncada, and that would also factor into that as well. So I ended up swapping him out. I put Moncada in there. He's going to play third base for the Brewers. You just got to kind of hope that he has one of those productive years, and then we'll see what happens. Again, I'm not the most confident in him. I just think that you're kind of you're playing a game here where you're not going to get a great choice. So this is the one that I went with for the reasons that I outlined. And part of it was as well, I wanted to have the money for my next signing, which is Randall Grichuk. My guess is that, the $4.5 million that I have here for him is probably a little more than the Brewers would want to pay for a guy who's going to be filling the role I have him filling. But I really do think he could be a difference maker in that capacity. He crushes left-handed pitching. That was basically the entire role he played for the Diamondbacks this year. And if anyone was watching those Diamondbacks games where the Brewers played him twice in like 2 weeks, Randall Grichuk would never face right-handed pitching. And it was like a hyper-specific role that the Diamondbacks had him in. It was a very strict platoon with Jock Peterson. And Torey Lavelle was not afraid to make some pinch hit moves for either one of these guys very early in the game just to get that matchup that he wanted. I think he would step very nicely into that Gary Sanchez role of being a guy who's here primarily to hit against left-handed pitching. And I think he actually makes for a better bench as well than what the Brewers had with Gary Sanchez and then Eric Haas. Now you can have Eric Haas and Randall Grichuk, with Grichuk being someone who can at least play the outfield. He's not a good defensive outfielder, but he's not terrible in the corner spot either. So you could also throw him out there to spell Christian Yelich sometimes if you need to, or spell somebody else in that outfield. It gives you a little bit more that you can do here. So again, got Moncada here, got Grichuk here. Those two guys are combining for nearly $10 million on the current payroll. I have a mutual option for both of these guys as kind of a way to defer a little bit of money. I got that $1 million buyout tacked on the end for Moncada. I have $2.5 million for Grichuk because, again, I'm kind of thinking back to what the Brewers did with Gary Sanchez. I think his deal ended up being like $3 million guaranteed with like a the buyout was a little bit more than I think you thought it would have been. It was a $4 million buyout.
Yeah.
So again, like you're kind of almost splitting that deal in half a little bit, and that's kind of what I did here. But I think that these are two guys who can round out the position player group decently. Again, it's not ideal, but I don't think the Brewers really have an ideal path here unless they are able to hit on some super creative trades. Then the rest of the way, my other free agent signings are just kind of scrap heap type guys. So Spencer's free agent signing for the bullpen was Lucas Sims. I went with Sean Armstrong. This is a guy who's a little bit older. He's 34. He was almost a Brewer several years ago. He was one of the guys who was in that vetoed Jonathan Lucroy deal to Cleveland. Yeah. So he's bounced around a little bit since then. But he had a super great year with the Rays in 2023 after making some changes to his pitch mix. Didn't have a great 2024, bounced around between 3 different teams, but I like him a lot as a bounce back guy. He's cutter, four-seamer, sinker, almost exclusively mixing those 3 fastballs. They do tunnel very well off of each other. I think he's a guy who you just need to think of kind of starting everything down the middle and everything just kind of diverges from there. He does have a slider as well. He added a sweeper this year that he threw a little bit as well. I don't know if he necessarily needs that. I think you can kind of pick one or the other to use moving forward. In 23, when he was really good, he only had the slider that he would break out every once in a while. But he did lose a tick of velocity this year, and he mainly lost his ability to get chases out of the strike zone. When he was at his best, for a couple of years, he was on a run where his chase rate was elite. It was not elite in 2024. It was a little bit below average, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly off the top of my head. But either way, a very steep drop from where it was before. This is where I feel like the Brewers can get that back through some changes to how is he using each pitch? How is he sequencing, starting things out of the right tunnel? I think that was quietly something that they did a pretty good job of with Tobias Myers, like just getting things starting out of the right tunnel to have everything play as deceptively as possible. They did it with Savali a little bit too, with kind of some of the tweaks they made for him. But I think he's another candidate who could really benefit from that if you can get the chase back. The in-zone whiffs were on most of his pitches still pretty good. It went down a lot on the sinker, but the four-seamer at the top and the cutter down and away to righties both continued to get a lot of whiffs. So I think if you can really just kind of get that chase back, everything's going to fall into place pretty quickly. Would be great if he gets that additional tick of velo that he lost before. I don't think he needs it, though. He still averaged like 93 with his fastballs. So I just think this is a guy, though, again, kind of like what you talked about before, Spencer, in that mold of, cheap scrap heap reliever. If it clicks, great. The one thing I struggled with here was I've talked a lot about this on the podcast so far, wanting to maintain more optionable spaces in the
Yeah.
bullpen, more optionable slots. So at first I had Elvis Peguero and JB Bukowskis both in my bullpen to kind of be in those capacities. But then I thought to myself, like, if Sean Armstrong does not work out, you can cut him very quickly and you get that spot
Yep.
back. Or there's also the possibility that if you have some regression from someone like Jared Koenig, maybe he ends up using that option during the year. Like, it'll probably work itself out. So that's what I ended up going for. And then I had Spencer Turnbull on here for the longest time. I want Spencer Turnbull. I agree with everything you said about him. I'm just not sure the Brewers are going to fully be able to afford him when everything all shakes out. Like, it's going to be a little tricky to squeeze that in there. I played with a couple different contract structures. I just couldn't fully get it to work. So it kind of is what it is at this point. And I decided that's just not one of the directions that I was going to go. So with that in mind, I ended up picking Ross Stripling up on a minor league deal. Again, a guy who you can guarantee a couple million to if he cracks the big league roster. But when I was kind of looking at him as someone who you might see in that mix, I see him as a guy who could potentially bounce back because he made an interesting tweak to his slider last year. He kind of tried going for that Pete Fairbanks uh, death ball type pitch where it's like the really sharp gyro slider where the bottom just falls out of it late. I do think that's something the Brewers might have some interest in working with, so you kind of play with that a little bit. He is, again, a kitchen sink guy too. The Brewers have done well with that kind of profile before. So just a guy who I think you could throw into that rotation mix. So now we'll move on to the one trade that I made. I did not go as aggressively as you did. I thought about a second one, but I ended up holding back on that. We'll touch on that in a little bit here when we look at the full rosters. I sent Devin Williams to the Phillies. I know we answered the question before about potentially swapping him for Alec Bohm. I went a little bit of a different route. This one hinges a lot on I don't know for sure what Devin Williams' value is going to be. I'm leaning a little bit more on the conservative side, but then there was that report today where Ken Rosenthal speculated that his value could be going up because St. Louis is supposedly not shopping Ryan Helsley. But I kind of went for a somewhat similar package to what the Brewers pursued for Corbin Burns from the Orioles last year. I know we talked about that a lot as kind of being a good baseline to think about for a Devin Williams package. So I sent Devin Williams to the Phillies. Again, like Spencer talked about before, this is a team that could use some stability at the back of that bullpen. They're also probably losing Jeff Hoffman as well. So I think that's also something to factor in here as well. Looking at this now, I wonder if maybe you could get a little bit more from him. I think the other wild card in here is in as well is that John Middleton is a very aggressive win now guy. So I do wonder if you could kind of coax him into giving up a little bit more than he probably should. So maybe you can get more than the two players that I put in here. Spencer, I know you had a 3-player package for him. So again, kind of depends on the team and what you're dealing with. Again, this is what I don't like about this. All these factors that you don't know about. So it makes it hard to put it together, but I did the best I could. Devin Williams for right-hander Mick Abel. According to MLB Pipeline, he's the number 6 Phillies prospect. He was a little bit higher a couple of years ago. So he's a guy who I don't believe he's in the Pipeline top 100, but he is in the Fangraphs top 100. So again, kind of gives you a similar framework to that Corbin Burns deal where you had two guys who were in the top 30 for Baltimore. I believe DL Hall may have graduated at the time. I can't remember, but the last time he was in the rankings, he was in the top 30. So I'm counting that. And then I believe you had one of those guys was a top 100 prospect. So kind of a similar deal here. You have Mick Abel, and then I was trying to figure out who to throw in here for the second piece. I was kind of looking at a couple different guys, and finally, just to give you an idea of how much I struggle with this, I told Spencer, just pick one of these guys for me that I can throw in here. Spencer said Otto Kemp. I said that's one of the players I was looking at, so I'll take it. So we have Mick Abel and Otto Kemp. I'll start with Mick Abel. He's a former first-rounder, guy who has pretty good stuff. I think it's a profile that I could see the Brewers liking quite a bit. I can see the upside in it. He's a tall guy. He's like 6'7". He strides out a lot as he's driving toward the plate, so he gets good extension. So the fastball averages about 94 as a starter, but it looks more like 95 to 96 because of that extension. So he's got the four-seamer. He's got the sinker as well. So he's got multiple fastballs that he can play with. He's got the breaking ball. I think that this is a guy who really just needs to find the best way to harness those mechanics consistently, because he is a tall guy who drives down the mound. He's got a little bit of a lower slot for a guy his height. And that just kind of reminds me of a profile that the Brewers have had some success with before. I don't know if that means a whole lot because they've had success with all kinds of profiles, but we've seen them do this with these kinds of guys before. Like they helped Brian Hudson crack things pretty quickly. And he's not nearly as extreme as Hudson in all of those facets, but you can kind of see the similarities there a little bit if you watch some video of him pitching. The stuff is really, really good. He's basically seen as one of these high upside, high risk type profiles. Again, he's still one of the better pitching prospects in that Phillies system. He's in the Fangraphs top 100. The bugaboo for him has really just been the walks. If you look at his AAA numbers, they are ugly. They're not good. I believe he had an ERA over 6 in AAA in 2024. But guess what? When you're talking about making these kinds of trades, I think that we're seeing throughout baseball as teams get better and better at modeling stuff, that is what they are most focused on. They're not even really looking at, let alone the ERA in AAA, but even some of the other peripherals in AAA, more than anything, as they're trying to boil things down as far back as they can go and strip things as far down to the basics, to the core of that player as they can. Stuff is a big deal, and I think that this guy could be someone who the Brewers stuff models think pretty highly of. And if that's the case, I think that's someone who they would like to have as a headliner for Devin Williams. And I'm kind of blurring the lines here a little bit between what I think and what I think the Brewers think. So I'll throw it out there just to be clear. I like his stuff a lot, and I think he's someone who the Brewers could do well with. So that's why I put him as a headliner. Kind of similar to what you did, Spencer, where it's like the numbers aren't great, but you think the Brewers can do well with the profile. These are much different profiles in the headliners, but there's kind of different things that might be holding them back, and we think the Brewers can do a good job with them. And even if he's not a guy who most Brewer fans would look at him and say, like, this is what we got for Devin Williams, if he turns into what you think he can turn into, then he was a good return for Devin Williams, and that's what this is really about. I threw that one more name on there as well, an Otto Kemp. He was an undrafted free agent who has risen through the minor leagues pretty quickly. He got all the way up to AAA in 2024. He hit quite well at every stop until he got to AAA. There's a little bit of Oliver Dunn in this kind of profile. And again, I don't know if he's someone who I would really pencil into the big league roster right away, but this kind of gives you that second guy who's almost big league ready. I don't have Mick Abel on my roster either. Neither of these guys who I have in the return for Devin Williams are on my opening day roster, but I think they're both guys who you could see appear for the Brewers throughout the 2025 season. And then beyond that, I think you could see them taking on a much greater role. So with that in mind, we can jump into both of our final rosters. And this is where we'll kind of compare things a little bit. I'll start with kind of running through my lineup a little bit. I'm guessing we have a lot of people who are audio only here, so I'm going to run through the whole thing so you know what it looks like. Against right-handed pitching, I have Jackson Chourio leading off in left field, Christian Yelich DHing batting second, William Contreras batting third as the catcher. I have Yohan Moncada in that cleanup spot at third base. I don't think the Brewers have anyone who profiles well as a cleanup hitter, so I, at this point, chose to focus a little bit more on just kind of splitting guys up, setting things up in a way that works for substitutions later in the game, things of that nature. So I have Moncada in that cleanup spot. I have Rhys Hoskins batting fifth at first base, Garrett Mitchell batting sixth as the center fielder, Joey Ortiz batting 7th as the shortstop, Sal Frelick and Bryce Terang rounding out that batting order in right field and then at second base. Against lefties, it's pretty similar. Churio, Yelich, Contreras. Then I have Grichuk batting cleanup as the right fielder. Again, a guy who really crushes lefties. Hoskins still in the 5-hole. I bumped Moncada down to 6th against lefties. He's actually got better splits against righties than lefties anyway, so that's kind of why I did that as well. And then Joey Ortiz still batting 7th. I have Blake Perkins in center field against left-handed pitching because he's a switch hitter, and he's done fairly well at times as a right-handed hitter. He's shown a little bit more power from that side of the plate, so that's why I have him in there. And then this is the one that I wanted to talk about because I think this is the one that might surprise some people. I have Vinny Capra on my roster, and I have him playing second base against lefties over Bryce Terang. So in terms of the only true bench guy who I never have starting unless he's giving someone a rest day, like giving William a rest day, is Eric Haas. I don't have him as like one of my preferred starting 9 in any version of this lineup. So Vinny Capra being on this roster for me, Spencer, I didn't do what you did. I didn't go out and sign a utility option because I just don't think John Birdie's giving you anything significantly more valuable than in-house utility options, to the point where I was okay signing him to a $4.5 million deal. I went elsewhere with kind of how I chose to spend the money. I ended up putting it in Grichuk instead, a guy who is a little bit more of a limited role, I think, than probably John Birdie, but I think he gives you more of a need, or fulfills more of a need, than I think John Birdie does. So that's why I went that way. But basically at that point, that meant it came down to Andre Monasterio or Vinny Capra. Vinny Capra's out of options. I think offensively he's close enough to Monasterio. Monasterio, I would say, has an even better eye than Vinny Capra, but Vinny Capra also is a good plate discipline guy. He draws a lot of walks, doesn't strike out a lot, doesn't hit for power, but that's okay. Vinny Capra, I think, is a better defender than Andre Monasterio, especially if you need to put him at shortstop in a pinch. Vinny Capra has also played more outfield than Andre Monasterio, and he's out of options. So I think I prefer Vinny Capra in this role over Monasterio. And it's kind of what you would have to do anyway if you want to keep both guys, because Monasterio still has a full set of options. Vinny Capra is going to be out of options in 2025. So that's kind of why I went with that here. I have him starting at second base against lefties. You can put Bryce Terang in there. I don't think it matters a ton. I just threw Vinny in there because Bryce Terang is basically a pitcher batting against left-handed pitchers for good stretches of time. His splits against lefties again this year were really, really bad. I think he had an OPS in the 400s against left-handed pitchers, so that's why I did that. But you can change that if you need to. Looking at the starting rotation, I have Freddie Peralta, Tobias Myers, Aaron Savali. Again, I tried to work out a trade for Aaron Savali. I think the Brewers will trade Aaron Savali. Number one, it was just hard for me to come up with that kind of deal because I think what you're getting in return is probably like a very toolsy lottery pick or a very toolsy lottery ticket. And I just was not going to go through jumping through all the hoops to try to find that guy because they're a little bit a dime a dozen. But also, again, like when you're looking at the finances of this thing, unless you're able to give Spencer Turnbull like a $4 million up front with a $3 million buyout or something like that, I don't know that it's quite the right move to make. Again, I like Spencer Turnbull's upside a lot more than Aaron Savali. The problem is, if they're going to end up costing roughly the same, I think it just makes more sense for the Brewers to keep the guy who you know is at least going to stay healthy and give you innings. Aaron Savali has the durability argument on his side, so I think that matters. Again, I think they will trade him, but I think there's a pretty compelling case to be made that you're just better off paying him $8 million to be kind of that mid to back of the rotation guy, especially given how many moving parts you're probably going to have in this rotation throughout the entirety of 2025. I think he's going to give you some necessary stability, not always in the form of his performance, but just in the form of his presence. Because I think outside of Freddie Peralta and Aaron Savali, we're going to see some musical chairs again in 2025 in that rotation. I think Tobias Myers is a regression candidate. And then I think the guys who I have rounding this out, Brandon Woodruff in that 4th rotation slot, and then one of DL Hall or Ross Stripling in that 5 spot. Like I said, Tobias is a regression candidate. Brennan Woodruff, I just don't think you could count on for much at all coming off of a major surgery that has kind of a muddy outlook. Not really a huge track record of guys coming back from this thing. The samples that we do have are pretty mixed. And then again, I want to try DL Hall as a starter one more time, but I don't know if it's going to work, especially if he doesn't have a good fastball as a starting pitcher, like I've talked about before. So I think you kind of do need Aaron Savali in there. So I ended up hanging on to him. Then in the bullpen, we have Trevor McGill, Yoel Payamps, Jared Koenig, Aaron Ashby. I'm keeping Ashby in the bullpen. I think there's still a tantalizing argument for trying the starter thing one more time. But just seeing how immediately things clicked out of the bullpen, it was kind of just the final straw for me. Like, it's almost a destiny type thing. Like, it just feels like that's where he's meant to be.
Yeah.
Ironically, he was actually doing it out of the pen with an arsenal that I think has now set him up even better to start if he can maintain that level of stuff on all those pitches, because he used a little bit more of a sophisticated approach when he was coming out of the pen at times late in the year. He was trusting the fastball a lot more, but he was also going a lot more curveball to righty and then slider to lefty as opposed to just heavy slider before. Like, you could tell he seemed a little bit more evolved actually this time around pitching out of the bullpen. So I think that actual mix and that pitch distribution would work as a starter. What I'm worried about is I'm not sure that he can actually throw it with the necessary conviction as a starter. There just seems to be something about pitching out of the bullpen that just gets him in the right place mentally, physically, where it all just seems to come together. And seeing it happen almost immediately when he went to the bullpen was kind of the moment for me where I actually started buying into, I don't fully know what it is, but there just seems to be something about it where he can only pitch with the conviction he needs out of the bullpen. So I'm content with keeping him there. Rounding out the bullpen, I have Nick Mears, Brian Hudson, Sean Armstrong, and then JB Bukauskas is in that kind of shuttle slot. I still like him a lot if he's healthy. If it doesn't work out, you can also, use Elvis Peguero in that slot as well at the back end of the bullpen. You have some flexibility there. Abner Uribe as well as someone who could occupy that spot from time to time as well. So my final opening day payroll, when you crunch all the numbers, is just north of $111 million. I really wanted to get it to where you got it. You got it down to about $108 million. I think that's the most realistic one. But again, like, this is tricky to do. You kind of start to realize once you go through it how little flexibility you actually have if that's your number with payroll.
Yeah, 100%. And I'll go through mine here. I think just to touch on what you talked about with Birdie and Grichuk, I do really like the idea of Grichuk. I think somebody who mashes lefties in that outfield especially would be fantastic for the Brewers. For me, Birdie, it came down to that versatility, but I do think you have a fair point that there are a lot of options for people who can do that on the Brewers. So I don't hate the idea of, swapping him out for a Grichuk. Like, I would have no problem with the Brewers doing that. Basically, that's all it is in terms of what we paid him. It's the exact same. So that would make some sense to me. But running through my lineups here quick, against righties, I did put Mitchell leading off. It would be between him and Frelick for me. I don't want Terang leading off anymore, but I do like the idea of having a lefty with some speed right at the top of the order here. And part of it is that I want Jackson Terrio to be my 2-hitter and Yelich my 3-hitter against righties. Like, I wanted that in my lineup. I wanted the chance for Terrio to immediately come up with a guy on base his first at bat of the game. I think that there's value in him having the potential to immediately drive in runs. But that's my top 3. It's Mitchell, then Jackson Terrio, Yelich. William Contreras is cleanup. Like you said, there's really not a guy that I love in the cleanup spot. But we know there's big time power potential for William. So if we can see him elevate the ball a little bit more, he could be a really good cleanup hitter in that role. Rhys Hoskins is batting 5. Joey Ortiz is 6. Sal Frelick 7. Michael Garcia is 8th, playing third base, of course. And Terang's 9th. And that's where Terang would be for me whenever he's playing. Looking at my lefty lineup, same as Jack, I do not have Terang in my everyday lineup against lefties. I do have Churiel leading off in this one Yelich is batting second. William moves up to the 3 spot. Basically, just move the 2, 3, 4 hitters up to 1, 2, 3 in my lefty lineup. Rhys Hoskins is my 4 hitter, and he does hit lefties well, especially for his career. It wasn't great last year, not as good as we've seen before, but he's always been in the past a very good hitter against lefties. I have Michael Garcia hitting 5th. I could swap him and Joey Ortiz in that 5-6 hole pretty easily. I would have no issue with either of them in that spot. This is not a very powerful part of the lineup, and I do think that's where Grichuk would come in very handy in this lineup. So I think that's the best argument here, because John Birdie is batting 7th for me. Perkins is batting 8th, and then Frelick is my 9-hole hitter going lefty-lefty. I don't love that, but I do think he at least holds his own against lefties. I don't think it's a terrible matchup for him. He does a pretty good job of hanging in there against lefties. But my 2 bench guys, Jack mentioned Haas is the only one who doesn't start for him in any or either lineup. Haas is, again, same for me, but Oliver Dunn is the guy I have on my bench. The more I thought about it, I actually think I might put Isaac Collins in over him, given the whole state of the lineup. And if I put Grichuk on the roster, I actually might do that even more, just with the switch hitting, having the ability to steal bases off the bench, that type of thing. Capra, I'm just not a huge Capra guy. Like, I get it. I think there's plenty of reason for why you did it that way, but I'm just not a huge fan of Capra. But yeah, I have Dunn there. I don't think there's a lot of options there, and I could go a lot of different directions. I don't think it'll be super important. I bet you it'll be a rotating door in that spot like it has been in the past. And then on the starting pitching side, Freddie's my 1. Tobias Myers is my 2. I have Woodruff in the 3. I'll talk about that in a second. Turnbull is my 4. And then I have DL Hall and Will Warren, the guy I acquired in the Devin Williams trade, kind of fighting it out. Both are optionable. They're both fighting for that 5th spot in the rotation. Whoever doesn't win goes down to AAA and stays stretched out as the first depth piece for the starting rotation when somebody does inevitably go down or underperform or whatever it is. Woodruff, I have him 3rd just because the whole rotation isn't great. And he has the best track record, but there's still so much that could go wrong here with him. And obviously I'm rooting for it to go great, and I would love to see even close to the Brandon Woodruff we've had in the past, but my belief in that is not super high. I am just hoping that ends up being the case, because it would be a really, really big boost to this roster if he can give you even just solid starting innings this season. And then on the bullpen side, almost the exact same as Jack's. It's McGill, Payamps, Koenig, Ashby, Mears, Brian Hudson, Lucas Sims is my difference with Sean Armstrong, and then Bukauskas is my last pen guy. You also have, you mentioned Uribe and Peguero. I think Craig Yoho probably is up somewhat soon into next season. Mizorowski is going to be a candidate for either the rotation or the bullpen. They're going to have a lot of options
too.
Who?
Tyler J is still here.
Tyler J is still here. I'm not sure that'll last.
He's on the 40 man. He is on the 40 man. He has options, so he can't count him out.
That's true. That's true. Former top 10 pick, Tyler J. Only top 10 pick I can ever remember who was literally a reliever in college and destined to stay a reliever in the pros. And the Twins were like, yep, got to take him with the 6th pick. But yeah, Tyler J is there. They have a lot of different options. Davey Garcia could be somebody we end up seeing in the pen or in the rotation. Other rotation guys, you have Logan Henderson potentially. They protected Chad Patrick, which to me says they believe he could help if needed in the majors this year. And like I said, Mizorowski is at least still right now. It's going to take development, but I can't rule him out as a guy who could maybe make starts next year. And I will say on the Ashby thing, I agree completely. I would love if he could start and I could trust him to start and that I had belief in him as a starter, but I just don't anymore. But I think he could be a huge weapon for the Brewers out of the bullpen. A big time, like, strikeout guy, ground ball guy. That combo is not common. We've talked about that a couple of times before. That's what always kind of made us kind of like what we loved about his profile in general was that he got grounders and strikeouts, and that's just not very common, especially from a lefty. Um, so you can put him in leverage spots where you need a ground ball. You can put him in a spot where you need a strikeout. You can put him against any part of the lineup. He faces righties and lefties fine. Big fan of Ashby in the pen. It would be great if he could start, but I just don't see it happening. So that's my full roster. Like Jack mentioned, that came out to basically 108 million total. I do think that's basically what we're looking at. I don't think it gets too much higher than 110 million. If there's some crazy deal sitting out there, it reminds like the Yasmani Grandal deal kind of comes to mind for me always on that type of thing where it's like he's willing to sign a 1-year deal and we can push the budget for a year. Like, yeah, we're going to do that. I don't think anything like that's going to be out there this offseason. I'd be pretty surprised, especially he was a non qualifying offer guy. So the Brewers didn't lose a pick or anything. Like it's unlikely that would happen. So I think this is what you're looking at. You're down Willie. You're down, you've lost guys like Colin Ray and all these people who are kind of depth pieces on the roster. So you're kind of replacing a lot of those guys with our plans. I think that was mainly what we were doing. And then the main big piece that the Brewers are probably looking at is third base. And like Jack talked about, and we talked about a lot, and it could be second base. It could be a bunch of different things. I think their main hope is to be third base. But like Jack talked about earlier, they're going through this exercise. I settled on Michael Garcia, which says a lot about what the options are out there and how many stones they might have to overturn to try and find what they're looking for. And a second baseman might end up being what it is. And in that case, Terang plays short. And I don't love it either. I agree with Jack completely on everything he said there. But at some point, there's also a level of you have to do it if you have to do it. And you have to play the market the way it plays out. You have to live with it. If it doesn't fall into your lap with a good third baseman, you're going to be fine with Ortiz at third and Terang at short. That's not going to be a bad defensive alignment. I just think the best one is Ortiz at short. So that's what we ended up with. If you're watching it, you can see it all right in front of you. I think it was a fun exercise. I know Jack has his opinions on it, but I do think these types of things are, I view it, I actually like what you talked about where you kind of learn some things about what the Brewers are going to be dealing with this offseason, because that is one of the main things I always get from trying to do these things is like, wow, it always sounds so simple. It's like, oh, just go get a third baseman. Well, just find one that's reasonably cheap. That's not that difficult. Like when you think about all these things on a surface level, it's like, oh, you could go replace Savali with like a $5 million starter or something and be fine. And you'll save a little money and make the trade. And it's like, yeah, but those don't just grow on trees and they're not just sitting out there. And in past off seasons, the Brewers have been able to find those guys. There's a pretty good chance none of the people we signed or traded for are Brewers at the end of this. But I think the main thing is that I would bet somebody that kind of falls in line with the profile of what we looked for. I would bet at least one of those types of players is on the Brewers by the end of it. And I think that's the main goal here is to find people that make sense. They don't have to be the exact same players, but like a way to fill out a roster that makes some sense. You learn some things about different players. I learned some things about Yohan Moncada looking at him earlier. Like I didn't realize he had actually turned in some pretty good defensive seasons at third base. I remember one year where I thought he was a really bad defender. And he basically was crossed off my list before I even looked at him because I just thought he was a terrible defender and he's not. So these types of things, I just enjoy that because I look deeper into things and find out a little bit more about players and what the Brewers are going to be dealing with. So that kind of wraps up this. Jack, do you have any closing thoughts on this exercise and our rosters in general?
Not really. Just a reminder that kind of the reason we chose to do this now is because you probably are going to start to see the action pick up a little bit more in the coming weeks. Winter meetings next week, where we're going to see a little bit more action. As a reminder, the Rule 5 draft is happening on Wednesday during the winter meetings in Dallas. So if there's any news from that as well, that's also going to be breaking that week. So by the next time we talk to you, we should have something for you. But other than that, yeah, just it was an exercise. I'm still not going to say it was fun, but I will acknowledge I took some things from this, even if I'm not 100% convicted in the roster that I put together, the moves that I made. I think the general philosophy that I was trying to employ throughout, I think I stand by that. So that's probably what ends up mattering most for something like this. Because again, it's not apples to oranges. We're not MLB executives. We don't have the resources of MLB executives. So we tried to do the best that we could. But with that in mind, are there some minor league signings that you would like to talk to us about before we say goodnight?
Yes. Yeah, we can hit on those quick. Yeah, the Brewers, 3 signings really in the past, well, since we last recorded, I guess. I think it was a little over a week ago that most of these broke. First, right-handed pitcher John Duplantier, an outfielder Jared Oliva, and then an old friend, somebody that we have seen. He actually, I think, only made 1 appearance in the majors with the Brewers, but Thomas Pannone is back, a left-handed pitcher. So spent last year with the Cubs, kind of followed I think that was a council type of move to bring him back into the fold over there. He seemed like somebody that Craig would like to employ in a left-handed relief role. But starting with Duplantier, this is the one to me that is the most exciting and the one that I think could actually potentially impact the Brewers at some point this year. He's a name I could have mentioned as a potential kind of bullpen depth piece before. This is a guy who was a big prospect back in the day for the Diamondbacks. I believe he was top 100 at one point and one of the higher ranked pitching prospects in baseball. He's 6'4". He has 7 feet of extension. So it's something the Brewers do well with guys who have good extension. At 6'4", he has a pretty low release, nothing crazy. It's kind of Mick Abel like. It's not 5 feet, but it's about 5.5 feet, which is pretty low for somebody who's that height. But that extension kind of adds up and makes sense there. It's another guy who throws 6 pitches though, and he's a reliever, but he's got a good repertoire to work with. It's a fastball that plays pretty well. It had a 33% whiff rate on it in AAA. His cutter is another pitch that had a 26% whiff rate, which is pretty high for a cutter. His slider itself, which is mid-80s offering, kind of it's not quite a gyro slider, but it's kind of in that mold. I would say it's more in that realm than like a true slider. That had a 37% whiff rate against it. His knuckle curve had a 49% whiff rate against it in AAA. He also throws a changeup and a sweeper. Those are his least used pitches, and they're the ones that he also had kind of the worst results against. So I think he was with the Dodgers organization, I should note, last year. So for the most part, they're going to do the smart thing. They're going to have him using his best pitches the most often. But I just think this is a guy who, if you can hone in the command a little bit, he walked 17% of his hitters that he faced last year, which is way too high. But also just his in-zone command wasn't great, and he did give up some big hits because of that. But the stuff is all there. It's a type of profile, like Jack kind of mentioned before. It's a tall profile, a tall guy who has a lower release height, has big extension. He has a bunch of different pitches to work with. Like, that's kind of a mix of different profiles that the Brewers have been really good with before. It just feels like somebody who I could see impacting the pen at some point and getting those guys on minor league deals. And the Brewers love their guys with prospect pedigree. We talk about that a lot. He's definitely one of them, but this is a guy I could see at some point pitching in the Brewers bullpen and helping this year. So nice signing, in my opinion, there. They also signed a right-handed hitting outfielder, Jared Oliva. At one point, a pretty big prospect for the Pirates. He made his debut for the Pirates. Didn't do great in the majors. Just kind of struggled to get going at the major league level. He was actually in Double-A with the Mariners this year, so that says a little bit about where he's gone as a future big leaguer. He's 29 years old. For me, this is more just depth for the Brewers. Like I mentioned, there's just not that many outfielders in the system anymore. So I think he just kind of fills that role. But he's a good, solid baseball player. Like he plays good defense. He's got a pretty good arm out there. He puts up good at-bats. He struck out at an 18% clip. He walked at about a 10% clip. He doesn't chase a ton. It's just a good approach. Not huge pop, but there's some pop in there. So I think this is more just minor league depth, but you need those types of guys. And it is one who has some prospect pedigree, like I talked about. And then Thomas Pannone, I won't go too deep on him. He was a Brewer. He was a Brewer minor leaguer mostly. He pitched for Nashville for most of that season, but he did make one appearance for the Brewers. He was in AAA last year, and he was actually starting. He threw 152 innings in AAA last year, which I kind of forgot that he started for a while in Nashville as well. But when he came up to the Brewers, it was in a relief role. 3.54 ERA, FIP was under 4. He doesn't walk people. He's very consistently in the zone, always has been. But the fastball's like, it's Hobie Milner type of velocity. It's 87, 88, maybe 89. The curveball's pretty good. It's a slow curveball, kind of in the low 70s. But it's a guy who gets grounders more than anything. He's out there to try and miss barrels, not miss bats. And this is good depth for the Brewers. You put somebody like that in AAA, you always have them in your back pocket. And funny enough, I was going to mention Tyler J because it feels like this is kind of a way to potentially take Tyler J off the 40-man and have Tyler J waiting in the wings with Pannone. So I was wondering if that might be part of the reason they signed him here. But yeah, those are the three. I don't have too much to go on the minor league side because we're going to do a big minor league podcast, me and Joseph, again in the next day or two. And that'll come out early next week. But that's what I wanted to touch on. They made 3 minor league signings. Whenever they sign somebody this offseason, I'll try and give you something on them as much as I can find, because I want to give those guys some attention. And in the Brewers organization in particular, these guys end up mattering a lot. Like very often do these guys end up actually impacting the major league roster. So you can't ignore them. This is a part of the Brewers process. This is part of the roster churn that they do. This is part of how they make themselves consistently able to just get results, because they always have somebody waiting who can at least get the job done in AAA. They might not be studs. They might not be the best player in Major League Baseball, but they're going to be able to come up and keep a team in a game, do something an offensive player is going to put up a good at bat. He's going to be able to make a play in the field. And they just do that so consistently that it's really hard to find a time where the Brewers roster doesn't have a legitimate major league player at every spot. And that's not true of every roster. I know we don't look at them all as closely as we do with the Brewers, but there are plenty of times where teams are carrying guys who they don't even feel comfortable putting into a game. The Brewers try to accumulate as many of those types of players as they can, keep them in AAA, and if they need them, break in case of emergency, they're ready to go and ready to help. So that's what they're doing with a lot of these guys. But Duplantier, for me, is somebody who I actually think could be a real contributor for the Brewers, not just one of those like fill-ins as needed.
That brings us to the end of this week's show. Thank you all for tuning in. We hope you learned something. I think we certainly did with all of the research that we put into this week's edition. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I think it is more likely than not that we'll have some more substantial news to talk about the next time that we're back.
I hope so.
Would it be back on the air? I don't know if it's on the air because we're not live. Back on the recording. Whatever it is. We'll be back in a couple. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, and my guess is we'll have some kind of news, because even if something doesn't transpire during the winter meetings, I think you're going to see enough movement, whether it's other areas of certain markets getting into action now, and if a big fish comes off the board, that kind of opens the floodgates a little bit, or maybe the Brewers lay some groundwork for something during the winter meetings that happens later, or maybe the Brewers select someone in the Rule 5 draft. I'm not expecting them to. I don't think they will, but you never know. They picked Gus Varland not long ago, so anything can happen, but my guess is we'll have something for you. So we'll talk to you all then.